I kept rehearsing the sentence in my head until it stopped sounding like language and started sounding like a confession. It wasn't even a long warning. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't brave. It was only a few plain words that would have interrupted the room for a moment. The way a dropped glass interrupts a dinner. Everyone turning. Everyone suddenly aware of how thin the quiet was. I remember the feeling of the words collecting behind my teeth, pressing forward like they had weight of their own. I remember how my tongue lifted as if it had already decided, as if my body was moving ahead of my permission. Then I didn't say them. It didn't happen in a dramatic second. It wasn't a single sharp turn. It was a slow retreat that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. My mouth stayed closed. My face stayed calm. My hands stayed where they belonged. The world kept its shape. Inside, though, something started to split. One part of me standing up, reaching for the warning, the other part dragging him back down by the collar, hissing that it wasn't my place. That phrase, "not my place," became a kind of blanket. I wrapped myself in it so tightly I could pretend it was warmth and not hiding. I told myself there were rules for a reason. I told myself someone else would notice. I told myself I didn't know enough. I told myself my doubt was just nerves, just fatigue, just imagination sharpening shadows into threats. But it wasn't imagination. There's a particular kind of fear you learn in wartime that has nothing to do with enemy fire. It's the fear of being seen as a problem. The fear of being the man who complicates things. The fear of being the one who makes a clean decision messy. It's the fear of drawing attention in a world where attention can ruin you faster than I could picture it too clearly. The moment I spoke, the eyes turning toward me, not with gratitude but with irritation, the pause that would feel like judgment, the question, calm, controlled, almost polite, asking why I was speaking at all, and then what? I imagined my warning landing wrong, coming out wrong, sounding like accusation, sounding like I imagined their faces tightening, their patience thinning. I imagined the words, "Who do you think you are?" without anyone needing to say them. And beneath that, I imagined something even smaller and uglier in myself, the possibility that I was wrong. Because if I spoke and nothing happened, if the feared mistake never unfolded, then all I would have done was expose myself. I would have made my own anxiety visible. I would have handed them evidence that I couldn't handle pressure, that my mind wandered into doubt when it should have stayed straight. Silence was safer. Silence was clean. Silence let me remain what I was supposed to be, useful, invisible, obedient. I told myself I could still speak later, if I needed to. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. I told myself I wasn't choosing silence, I was choosing timing. But timing has a way of shrinking until it disappears. The room, wherever it was, felt too full for one small voice to change anything. The air felt thick with certainty that didn't belong to any in particular. Confidence passed between people like a shared cigarette, each inhaling and handing it on, until doubt felt like something you would have to cough out loud. I watched lips moving, heads nodding, hands pointing. I watched the shape of the decision forming, solidifying, becoming real, simply because everyone treated it as real. And all the while, my warning sat inside me like a stone I kept swallowing again and again. My heart didn't race. Not the way you'd expect. It slowed. It went heavy. It settled into a calm that scared me more than panic, because it felt like surrender wearing the mask of control. I remember thinking, if I speak, I become part of this. And then the thought that followed, quieter and more honest. If I stay silent, I can pretend I wasn't. I let my breath out through my nose. I kept my eyes steady. I made myself look like someone who understood and agreed, someone whose thoughts belonged to the same current as everyone else. And by the time the moment arrived, the last clean opening where those words could have mattered, I had already tucked them away, deep enough that even I could barely hear. I sat there, listening to my own silence, and I did what I would keep doing. I swallowed the words and let the world go on without. By the time I understood how much silence was built into place, it already felt permanent. There was an order to everything, visible even when no one spoke it aloud. You learned it the way you learn weather, by watching how people moved, where they stood, when they chose to disappear. Certain voices filled rooms without effort. Others learned to exist only in the margins, useful but quiet, present but never central. I belonged to the second kind. My days were shaped by repetition. Reports passed through my hands. Messages moved past my eyes. Decisions traveled downward like gravity, never pausing long enough for anyone below to question their direction. I wasn't tasked with choosing paths. I was tasked with making sure paths stayed clear. There was comfort in that at first. A relief in knowing that responsibility had already been claimed by someone else. When things went wrong, and they always did, it was never wrong because of us. It was wrong because of circumstance, or timing, or forces too large to name. The structure absorbed blame the way thick walls absorb sound. Above me were people trained not just to command, but to project certainty. Even when uncertainty flickered across their faces, it never lingered. Doubt was something you swallowed privately and digested alone. To let it surface was to admit weakness, and weakness traveled quickly in places like this. No one ever said, "Do not speak." They didn't need to. The rules were written in smaller gestures, in the way questions were answered without eye contact, in the way concerns were acknowledged with a nod, and then quietly, in the way someone who spoke too often was soon assigned elsewhere, not punished exactly, just removed from the center of. You noticed who stayed and who vanished. You learned when a pause was acceptable and when it wasn't. You learned that timing mattered more than truth, and tone mattered more than content. You learned that even correct information could become dangerous if delivered by the wrong mouth. I watched others learn it too. New arrivals would still carry a stiffness, a kind of hopeful tension in their shoulders, as if their thoughts mattered simply because they were accurate. It didn't last. After a few meetings, a few dismissals, a few quiet corrections delivered with polite smiles, their posture changed, their voices softened, their sentences shortened. Eventually, they learned to speak only when spoken to. The hierarchy wasn't cruel. That's what made it effective. There were no raised voices, no obvious threats. Authority wore the mask of reason. Decisions were framed as inevitable, necessary, already weighed from every angle. To challenge them wasn't framed as disobedience. It was framed as misunderstanding, and misunderstanding was dangerous. If you misunderstood, it meant you lacked perspective. If you lacked perspective, it meant you weren't ready. If you weren't ready, you didn't belong near decisions at all. So you learned to watch carefully. You learned to listen for what wasn't said as much as for what was. You learned to measure your own thoughts against the temperature of the room before letting any of them rise toward your mouth. I became very good at that. I knew the rhythm of authority. I knew when a decision was already settled, long before it was announced. I knew when discussion was theater, and when it was genuine. I knew which silences were invitations and which were warnings. Most of the time, I kept my observations to myself. They stayed folded inside me like maps no one had asked to see. The environment rewarded that restraint. I remained where I was. Useful, trusted, in a limited way, not important enough to blame, not insignificant enough to discard. It was a narrow balance, but it was survivable. Fear didn't arrive suddenly. It accumulated. It lived in the small consequences. In the memory of a colleague who spoke out of turn and was later described, casually, as difficult. In the way his name stopped appearing on lists. In the way no one asked where he went. It lived in the knowledge that war did not forgive friction. Smooth systems were prized. Anything that slowed movement, even caution, was treated as an obstacle. Above all, it lived in the certainty that those who spoke carried their words alone. Once spoken, a warning no longer belonged to the person who gave it. It became something to be judged, interpreted, weighed, and, if inconvenient, dismissed. And the speaker remained, marked by having tried. I understood my position clearly. I was close enough to see patterns, but far enough to lack permission. Close enough to recognize risk, but not close enough to redefine it. So when tension crept into routine, when the familiar rhythm began to falter in ways I couldn't ignore, I didn't react outwardly. I cataloged, I observed, I waited. That was what people like me did. Waiting felt responsible. It felt disciplined. It felt like respect. And in a structure like ours, respect mattered more than because alarm suggested chaos, and chaos was always treated as a greater enemy. I stayed quiet, not because I didn't understand what was happening, but because I understood exactly where I stood. And in that understanding, silence didn't feel like a choice. It felt like the only language I was allowed to speak. Once the thought took shape, it didn't leave me alone. It followed me through the smallest routines, through tasks I could have done blindfolded. I would be reading one thing while thinking about another, my eyes moving forward while my mind doubled back, replaying the same sequence again and again, searching for an angle that made silence feel justified. At first, I treated the thought like a suspicion rather than a conclusion. I told myself I was overinterpreting fragments, connecting points that didn't belong together. War sharpened instincts, but it also distorted them. Everyone knew that. Fear could masquerade as insight. Doubt could dress itself up as foresight. So I tested my own thoughts quietly. I watched faces longer than necessary. I listened to tone instead of word. I paid attention to what people rushed past and what they lingered on. I compared what was said aloud to what was written down, and what was written down to what was never written at all. Each time, the same discomfort returned. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single glaring flaw. That was the problem. It was subtle, layered, almost elegant in its wrongness. A small assumption carried too far, a condition treated as permanent, a risk categorized as acceptable because acknowledging it fully would have slowed everything else. I told myself that if it were truly dangerous, someone else would have noticed. Someone with more authority, someone whose voice would land differently in the room. That belief became a crutch. I leaned on it heavily, but the longer I leaned, the less convincing it felt. I started noticing how often people deferred upward without actually passing information along. how often uncertainty was softened before it reached the top, how easily inconvenient details were reframed as manageable variables. I realized then that knowledge didn't travel cleanly. It warped as it moved. It lost its edges. By the time it reached those who decided, it had been sanded down into something easier to hold. That was when the pressure began. I would open my mouth in my mind, form the sentence silently, imagine the exact tone I would use. Calm, precise, respectful, no accusation, no panic, just enough to introduce friction, to force a pause. And then I would imagine the response. Not anger, not punishment, something worse. Polite dismissal, a nod, a brief acknowledgement, a reassurance that the concern had already been considered, that contingencies existed, that experience outweighed speculation. I imagined myself standing there afterward, having said my piece, feeling smaller rather than relieved. I imagined walking away unsure whether I had helped or simply revealed myself as someone who didn't understand how things worked. That fear grew teeth. Because I wasn't entirely certain, I believed strongly, but belief was not proof. I could trace the risk, outline the logic, but I couldn't point to a single undeniable fact that would force agreement. And without that, my warning would be fragile. Fragile warnings break easily. I began bargaining with myself. I told myself I would wait for one more sign, one more confirmation, something concrete enough to justify the disruption. I told myself that speaking too early could be as harmful as speaking too late. Each delay felt reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern I didn't want to. There were moments, small, sharp moments, when the weight inside me surged so suddenly that I nearly acted. A phrase would escape halfway, stop just behind my lips. My chest would tighten, my pulse would quicken, just enough to remind me that time was moving whether I spoke or not. In those moments, fear split in two directions. Fear of what might happen if I stayed silent. Fear of what would happen to me if I didn't. I rehearsed consequences obsessively. If I spoke and was right, would anything actually change? Or would the machine continue, absorbing the warning as just another data point? If I spoke and was wrong, would that mistake follow me? Would it define me? The answers never settled. What did settle was a quieter, more corrosive thought. That responsibility could be diluted by hierarchy. That because I wasn't the one deciding, I wasn't fully accountable. That knowledge carried weight only when paired with authority. I hated that thought. I didn't trust it. But it was comforting in a way that scared me. It allowed me to imagine myself as an observer rather than a participant, as someone witnessing risk, not enabling. It let me believe that silence was passive, neutral, almost harmless. And yet, every time I returned to the imagined moment, standing there, choosing whether to speak, I felt the same sensation in my body. A tightening, a pressure, as if something essential was being held underwater. Silence stopped feeling empty. It felt crowded with everything I hadn't said yet, crowded with words that pressed harder the longer they were contained, crowded with the knowledge that once the moment passed, no later explanation would matter. I knew that if I waited too long, the decision would solidify. It would become fact, and then any warning would transform into accusation, hindsight, disloyalty. That knowledge sat with me constantly, and still, each time the opportunity hovered close enough to touch, I found a reason to let it drift past. Not because the fear went away, but because the fear of speaking had learned how to sound like reason. The moment didn't announce itself. There was no sharp silence beforehand, no sense of time slowing the way people describe later. It arrived disguised as routine, folded into a sequence that looked identical to 100 others. Papers moved, voices stayed even. Someone spoke with the calm assurance of a decision already made. I felt it before I understood it. A tightening at the base of my throat, a sudden heat in my face. My hands went still without me telling them. The warning rose all at once. No longer tentative, no longer theoretical. It was complete now, clear enough that I couldn't pretend it was only doubt. This was it. I knew, without drama, without panic, that if I spoke now, the shape of what followed might change, not necessarily improve, not necessarily be prevented, but altered, interrupted, forced to account for something it was about to ignore. The words were ready. They had lost their rough edges. They fit together cleanly, almost gently. I didn't need to search for them. They were waiting, and so was everyone else. Not look. That was the problem. Their attention moved along its expected path, flowing toward the person whose voice carried. The decision settled into the room the way dust settles after movement, quietly, inevitably. No one leaned back. No one paused. There was no invitation hidden in the silence. No opening meant for someone like me. If I spoke, I would have to tear the moment open. I imagined the sound of my own voice breaking the rhythm. I imagined how wrong it would, how foreign. I imagined heads turning, not urgently, not with concern, but with surprise, with calculation. I became acutely aware of my body, of how visible speaking would make me, how impossible it would be to take the words back once they existed in the air, how silence, by contrast, left no trace. My breath caught halfway in. I held it there, shallow and careful, as if movement itself might betray me. Someone nearby shifted their weight. Someone else nodded. The decision was no longer forming. It was formed. It had weight now, momentum. This was the last clean moment. I felt something in me lean forward, straining, desperate not to be ignored any. It wasn't courage. It was urgency stripped of bravery. It didn't care how I would be seen. It only cared that the warning existed and that it mattered. But urgency doesn't outrank fear. Fear reminded me of place. Fear reminded me of consequences that had nothing to do with the decision itself. Fear reminded me that once I spoke, I wouldn't be able to retreat back into usefulness and anonymity. Fear won. Not loudly, not triumphantly. It won in the smallest possible way, by convincing me to wait one more second. That second stretched just long enough for the moment to pass. The sentence that would have changed everything never reached my lips. My jaw stayed locked. My tongue pressed uselessly against my teeth. I lowered my eyes, just slightly, enough to break whatever fragile alignment have pushed me to act. The room moved on. Someone confirmed the order. Someone else acknowledged it. The decision slid forward into action, smooth and unchallenged. Inside me, something went quiet, not relieved, not calm, just sealed. I told myself it was done now, that speaking would only complicate what had already begun. That silence, at this stage, was restraint rather than. My body agreed. It relaxed incrementally. My breathing returned. My face arranged itself into something. From the outside, nothing marked the moment, but I knew exactly when it happened. I knew the precise instant silence stopped being temporary and became irreversible. And I stayed there, motionless and unremarkable, as the world accepted my quiet as consent. The confirmation didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, scattered across hours and days, each piece small enough to dismiss on its own. A delay here, a report that didn't align there, a phrase repeated too carefully, as if precision might compensate for what was missing. I noticed everything. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. War was built on friction. Things rarely unfolded the way they were planned. Minor complications were expected, even welcomed, because they proved the system was alive, adjusting, correcting itself. But the pattern didn't break. Instead, it tightened. Each new detail echoed the shape of the warning I had swallowed. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but enough that my stomach would sink before my mind could assemble the logic. Enough that I began to recognize the future in the present, unfolding exactly along the lines I had traced in silence. I didn't speak then either. By that point, it felt too late. The decision had weight behind it, movement, commitment, reputation. To question it after the fact wouldn't be caution, it would be doubt. And doubt, once action had begun, was treated as sabotage of morale rather than concern for outcome. So I listened. I listened to voices lowering when certain names were mentioned. I listened to explanations that circled the truth without touching it. I listened to optimism stretched thin enough to be transparent. There were moments when the room would go briefly still, not in alarm, but in recalculation. Someone would pause, as if sensing that something wasn't lining up, and every time, the pause would be filled quickly, smoothed over with assurance, reframed as temporary, manageable, already accounted for. The machine adjusted without stopping. I started measuring time differently, not by clocks or schedules, but by distance. How far the consequences were from the moment I had stayed silent, how many steps removed, how many decisions layered on top of the original one, making it harder and harder to isolate where things had gone wrong. I knew where it had gone wrong. That knowledge became heavier with each confirmation, not explosive, not overwhelming, just steady, relentless. When the first undeniable loss occurred, it wasn't announced with drama. It was delivered clinically, stripped of context, framed as acceptable within parameters no one questioned aloud. There was no room in the language for grief, only for assessment. I felt something collapse inward, not shock, not disbelief, recognition. After that, everything sounded different. Words that once felt neutral now carried weight. Phrases about necessity and inevitability rang hollow. I could hear the spaces where alternatives might have existed, where hesitation might have altered the path. I thought about the sentence I never spoke and how small it had been, how easily it could have fit into the moment, how little it would have cost me to say it then, compared to what it was costing now to carry it alone. But the structure had moved past the point of listening. Responsibility flowed upward, away from me, but guilt flowed nowhere at all. It stayed exactly where it was, settling into my chest, tightening whenever confirmation arrived that my fear had been accurate. I watched consequences accumulate without spectacle. No single moment demanded reaction. No clear line marked the shift from risk to damage. It happened the way rot happened, quietly, invisibly, until the structure could no longer pretend it was sound. By the time the scale of it became undeniable, there was nothing left to say. Any warning now would have been framed as hindsight. Any concern would have been interpreted as self-protection. The silence I had chosen early had shaped the only version of me anyone could see. I remained useful, present, silent. Inside, I began counting not what had been lost, but what might have been interrupted, the pauses that never happened, the questions that were never asked, the breath I never took when it mattered. The world adjusted to the damage the way it always does, by absorbing it, normalizing it, folding it into the next set of assumptions, and I stood there, watching the consequences of my silence move forward without resistance, knowing they were no longer just the result of a flawed decision. They were the result of my choice to let it stand. Time didn't dull the memory the way I expected it to. It rearranged it. Years later, the moment still returns, but not as a scene I can watch from a distance. It comes back as a sensation first, a pressure behind the sternum, a tightening in the throat, the reflex to inhale and stop halfway through. My body remembers before my mind does. I learned early on that memory doesn't replay itself honestly. It edits. It sharpens some edges and erases others. Faces blur, voices fade, details dissolve into impression. But the silence, the exact shape of it, never changed. I can still feel how complete it was. At the time, I believed silence ended when the moment passed. I believed it was something temporary, a pause that would eventually be filled by events, by explanation, by distance. I didn't understand that silence has a longer lifespan than words. Words disappear once they're spoken. Silence doesn't. It stays lodged in the place where the words should have been. It hardens. It takes on weight. I carried that weight forward, into places where no one knew what had happened, where no one could have guessed what I had seen forming before it took shape. To them, I was untouched by the decision, peripheral, clean. I let them believe it was easier than explaining how guilt can exist without action, how responsibility can take root even when you follow every rule, how obedience can still leave a residue that never quite washes off. There were nights when I tried to rewrite the moment, not in fantasy, never heroically, quietly. I would imagine myself speaking calmly, reasonably, without emotion. I would imagine the room pausing. I would imagine the decision bending, just slightly, enough to redirect its force. The imagined outcome was never perfect. Sometimes it still failed. Sometimes the damage remained. But in every version, the silence was gone. That absence felt like relief. And then the real memory would return, unchanged, and the relief would collapse into something colder. I stopped trying to explain it to myself in moral terms. That only led to arguments I couldn't finish. I wasn't brave. I wasn't cowardly. I wasn't malicious. I wasn't innocent. I was silent. That fact resisted interpretation. It didn't ask to be justified or condemned. It simply existed, stubborn and complete. What surprised me most was how often the moment resurfaced without warning. Not during anniversaries. Not during reminders. It would appear in ordinary spaces, standing in line, waking up too early, listening to someone speak with absolute confidence about something they could not possibly know for certain. In those moments, I would feel the old pressure again, the instinct to interrupt, the urge to warn, and just as quickly, the memory of what it cost to stay quiet would rise with. I learned that silence doesn't end when consequences arrive. It continues afterward, reshaping itself into restraint, into caution, into a constant internal hesitation. It teaches you to doubt not just whether you should speak, but whether speech ever truly matters. I never told anyone what I had almost said, not because I was protecting myself. By then, that no longer mattered. I didn't speak because the words had expired. Once the moment passed, they no longer belonged to them. They belonged to me alone, and I carried them like evidence no one would ever examine. Sometimes I wonder if the worst part wasn't what happened afterward, but what didn't happen before. The brief interruption that never occurred. The fracture in certainty that might have slowed things just enough to matter. I don't tell myself it would have changed everything. That would be too easy. What haunts me is the smaller truth, that it would have changed something, and that something was real enough to be worth the risk I never took. Silence protected my position. It preserved my usefulness. It allowed me to move forward without visible damage, but it left something behind. A version of myself who spoke and was heard, even briefly, exists only in the space where the words should have been. I feel him sometimes, close but unreachable, like a shadow cast by a body that I have learned to live with that shadow. It doesn't accuse me. It doesn't forgive me. It simply stands there, patient and unyielding. A reminder that the most permanent consequences don't always come from what we. Sometimes, they come from the moment we decide not to speak. And once chosen, that silence never truly. It just learns how to sound like